welcome to those of you on the webcast. I hope you are following along and getting a lot from the program. It's very exciting here in person, largely because we have so many great comments from all of you, and we want to continue that with this panel as well. We've talked a lot about what is going on right now, what are the gaps. We've had lots of comments about successful projects, but in this panel, we're going to try to go a little deeper into those successful projects and think about what would be needed to bring these successful efforts to a level of scale that begins to feel like part of this national platform. I'm very happy to introduce the panelists we have talking about this. And let's see, in the order in which they are speaking, Jon Voss, who is, Jon, let me make sure I get your title right, the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Historypin. The second speaker will be Ann Wootton, who is the CEO of the Pop-Up Archive. The third speaker is Mary Flanagan, who is a professor at Dartmouth College. And the final speaker will be Trevor Muñoz, who is the Assistant Dean at the University of Maryland Libraries. When we've talked about gaps earlier today, we've heard indications of some of the things that are needed. Crowdsourcing solutions, computational approaches, linked data. These are some of the things that our panelists will describe today. And I hope that as they talk about their projects and how they think they might be expanded to become something bigger, I'd be very interested in having them comment on what are the emerging technologies that make these solutions possible? What kinds of criteria can we apply to other projects to see if they fit into this national landscape that we've been describing? And what needs to happen to move projects from individual research projects or individually funded projects to something bigger? And then I have another question I'd like all of you to think about. We have a number of national organizations that have a mission to serve our needs. And there are lots of them, but just for sake of argument, there's the Library of Congress, the National Archives, OCLC. Internet Archive falls into this category, although with a different funding model, I will have to say. We have organizations with national missions. What do we need from them? And I'd really love to hear the panelists talk about that too. What can we do to make sure that all of our efforts are leading in at least a parallel direction, and pointing to something bigger that we can all be very proud of? So with that, I'm going to turn to the panelists for your comments.
Okay, I guess I will start. I'm Jon. I wear two hats, really, usually, at least. Historypin on one side, which is about building community around local history. And on the other side, I co-founded the Linked Open Data in Libraries, Archives, and Museums Summit, which is happening again in Sydney at the end of June. And it's the latter part that I'm going to talk a little bit about with Linked Open Data. And I have to say, it's amazing to be in a room with so many of you here and on the Twitter feed as well, this panel, some of my favorite people that I'm still getting to know. And knowing that I came completely from outside the cultural heritage world just 5 years ago as somebody passionate about stealing all of this stuff. And it turns out that people wanted to make it more available. So I'm excited to be a part of that. And I also say, right now I'm a bit sad with Nepal and Baltimore and extreme poverty, systematic racism, systemic rather, that it's hard to think that what we're doing is so important and takes such precedent. But at the same time, libraries are a lifeblood to so many people, and I think it really heartens me to know that particularly public libraries are there when all other government intervention has failed, and to see that again and again. So it's an honor to be here. Linked open data is something that gets thrown around quite a bit, and so just for a real quick second, what is it? And I'll say without getting into any technical detail that it's ultimately a combination of technology, policy, and law that has the potential to build a more useful, discoverable, and interoperable ecosystem. But more than anything, it's part of a fundamental cultural shift. So linked open data uses the technology of the World Wide Web to share resources in a machine-readable and predictable way. Those are the two key pieces to it. And technically, it's a combination of standards, tools, and protocols, but also licensing and data normalized to scale. So this is hopefully moving us from what started as a web of interlinked documents, remember in 1991, 92, to a web of interlinked data. And that is ultimately the potential. The environment and the culture of linked open data sees the web less as a traditional publishing platform, and I think this is part of the cultural shift, and more as a living, interoperable network and system that provides new and entirely different ways of engaging and collaborating with communities to enrich collections, connect them with the University of Knowledge, and build new things with them, which you're going to hear from the other panelists here, and the exciting opportunities around that. Well, what is it not, then? One, it's not magic. You can't write a grant and then say it's going to be linked open data too. That'd be awesome. There actually aren't computer wizards that can turn your content collections metadata into something it is not. It just doesn't work that way. There are standards and there are systems and protocols that allow us to do things and make things more easily accessible, but it's not going to happen just like that. It's also not a panacea. You can't say this is going to solve everything. You can't load lamp something and expect it to solve all these problems. And finally, it's not something that you can just buy. You can't say to a vendor, I need load lamp. Throw the load lamp on it. That'll make it work. It's got to be linked open data. We can push our vendors and work with our vendors collectively to build tools that make things more interoperable, and that's something we have to do. But that's really more about the policy bit of it, and less about the technology. The potential is huge here, obviously. Unlocking the world's cultural heritage data for good is a big deal. As Dan Chudnov's talked about, one big library. This is ultimately where we can start to bring things together, use them together in ways that we're not just going to one place, but that we have at our fingertips all of the world's knowledge. Well, it's a dreamy big idea, but crazy enough, the technology is already here. Seb mentioned, though, the shifts for us here in cultural heritage are really more about licensing and policy. On the enterprise level, linked data is being used in major, massive corporations around the world to link disparate data sets around their regions, et cetera. 1 minute? Oh, geez. But for us, I think it can be something bigger. So let me dig into, you've heard mention of, obviously today, Digital Public Library of America, Europeana, Digital NZ. These are massive international aggregates that are starting to make things useful in more ways. So what I expect us to see in my last minute, and hope to see is more specifically, and we can dig into this in the Q&A probably, is more multi-institutional collaborations focused on specific domains. So there are more and more projects like LinkJazz, Emblematic Online, that are taking a discrete domain, 2 identifiable resources, and hopefully from multiple institutions, and building applications and visualizations around them. It doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be major resource suck. It's experimental. It's 1993 in the world of the web, basically, when we think about linked data. So I'm hoping to see more of this community approach. And finally, the dream about linked open data is a community approach in which we can take this technology, use the culture of the World Wide Web, and let it change everything.
Thanks, John. Anne.
Sure, okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Anne, and I'm one of the co-founders of Pop-Up Archive. And I think if there's one takeaway you get from my remarks today, it should be that I would like to offer all of your moms an API tutorial. And I think that any of these computational scalable projects that are worth funding should do the same. And even if they're not able to give you or your mom the tutorial themselves, they should absolutely have extensive and interactive documentation so that you can teach yourself. Some quick background on Pop-Up Archive. And I think the reason I'm sharing my experience right now is because of the work that we're doing specifically with, through a hybrid business model to help scale both preservation of digital audio. We work with disparate sources from individuals to very large institutions and partner with the Internet Archive in doing that. And then also accessibility, in part through computational creation of metadata, specifically automatically generated transcripts and semantic analysis of audio and speech. So audiovisual collections have received a lot less attention to date than text and image-based ones, understandably. And fundamental improvements in computational capacity are definitely changing that, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg. I could talk all afternoon, and I will touch briefly on some of the recent significant improvements in speech-to-text software, for example, but I don't think that my role here today is to share all of those details. I'm happy to talk about it more, offline or online. So, significant improvements in speech-to-text software that we see already being applied commercially, whether it's through voice recognition and command like Siri, or medical transcription, which Nuance is a major commercial provider of. There are trade-offs, of course, between accuracy and search. One of our engineers wrote a blog post for Medium on the trade-offs between accuracy and search for public media, if you're curious about that. And then the potential for this technology when we apply it to large AV collections that have previously only been searchable at best via limited metadata and cataloging. On that note, I would like to mention the importance of combining computational approaches, whether speech-to-text or other waveform analysis, like the HIPSTAS project at UT Austin, with crowdsourcing efforts like metadata games and Tilt Factory, which I'm sure Mary will tell you more about with her work at Dartmouth. So that is automation plus human intelligence, which is critical. And the BBC's work on the World Service Archive is a really great example of, there are open source components that they're slowly releasing as a part of that work. But more fundamentally, we built Pop-Up Archive because everyone at small and medium-sized organizations was asking for drag and drop. They wanted something that was as easy to use as Facebook. They wanted it to integrate with the commercial cloud storage they were already using, and they wanted to be able to tweet it with the click of a button. So we had already spent a year at the UC Berkeley School of Information, my co-founder Bailey and I, doing user research and surveying the broad ecosystem of archival audio. At the same time, bigger organizations want to handle this computational work themselves, and they have more complex access policies and rights considerations, and should absolutely still be able to benefit from taxpayer-funded projects. So it requires a very thoughtful balance of outputs, which in my experience so far is frankly very hard to strike. So for this reason, in terms of criteria and what needs to happen, I would highlight, as many others have today, the importance of interoperability, accessibility, reusability, and educational resources. And this is generally where APIs come into play. More specifically, successful computational projects need to take into account international standards for AV collections, whether metadata schemas like PB Core and EBU Core on the AV side, which are also leveraging linked data to talk to each other, integrate with national databases like the DPLA, linked data efforts like what Jon just talked about. And then arguably one of the most important roles that Pop-Up Archive has played is as a straightforward web interface and set of educational resources that help producers and archivists and the general public ultimately benefit from research that otherwise would sit dormant indefinitely in an open source repo on GitHub. The Internet Archive's TV News Archive also comes to mind as a good example of that type of project. We talk a lot about the various merits and drawbacks of software as a service versus downloadable open source packages versus other open source software that still interacts with some sort of external processing or supercomputing. We work with a variety of these technologies. And I'll pass on the detail there because I don't have a lot of time, but our experience is that bringing these research ideas to broad implementation requires a combination of these technologies. And ultimately what we're up against, not surprisingly, is that regardless of size, the organizations that stand to benefit from this type of scaling are limited in terms of their resources and their aversion to risk. So I think it's pretty standard for government-funded projects to be open data projects, but there's a big spectrum in terms of open data that museums and libraries and archives can use, and open data that they don't even have the resources to handle. Small and medium-sized organizations like the San Francisco Independent Radio Producers, the Kitchen Sisters, who we started our work with, don't even have, they can barely set up their own MySQL database to run OMACA. But then bigger institutions have all kinds of rules about firewalls and access. The DPLA is doing some really great work to review copyright policies and publish those findings, and we need that work desperately because no matter how much we're capable of computationally, it hardly matters if no one is ever going to hear it or see it. So I'll just close by saying, to get these grant-funded projects from research to implementation, it requires resources and vision and will to act. And in our experience with media organizations in particular, that often means connecting the potential and real vitality of the archive with the immediate pressing revenue concerns of the leadership. And that is rarely a question of technology.
Great. Thanks, Anne. Mary.
Hi. Yeah, this is great to follow up with Anne. It's like we're having this very intense conversation, also in our own minds. Yeah, I'm really pleased to be here representing not only the Metadata Games project, which is how I ended up as a designer in the museum, libraries, and archive space, but also the work that we're doing on a national level, building a crowdsourcing consortium or a national conversation about what we can actually do to implement, to come up with best practices and somehow bridge some of these challenges together. So folks in the panel, are, in one way or another, are really deeply engaged with creating these practical solutions for engaging with the public, for making systems that are smart, for making lightweight systems that can appeal to a variety of institutions. And that was one of the big motivators behind making Metadata Games, which is a software platform that actually decouples game interfaces from the core software architecture so that we can actually reskin front-end games and put games out into the public that solve a variety of challenging issues, such as collecting metadata tags, verifying or correcting, in the case of our work with the Bioheritage Diversity Library, correcting transcriptions that conflict with one another or that are run through OCR and have errors. So you can use game interfaces to engage with people in a variety of ways. And this is all, of course, inspired by Louis Van Ahn and his great work in the reCAPTCHA stuff and Google image search. But we're really trying to keep using these things for the public good, for an open source platform. And so the platform is designed to kind of have people be able to make their own game interfaces as well and own their own data, which is a central part of this whole thing. To date, the project served 45 different collections, so instead of serving a silo, it's moving across collections and institutions, including work with the British Library. Recently, we did a big push with the Holocaust Museum, generating hundreds of thousands of tags. So there's this way that we're trying to work across institutions. And trying to meet the demand of scale is really interesting. We took Dartmouth actually gave us some funding to do some Amazon cloud hosting tests because it wasn't in our original purview with our funding, which is currently from the NEH. Right. We did all this crowdsourcing testing with the cloud hosting stuff, and we found some really interesting stuff. Most of the organizations we're working with want us to host their data. The system is designed so that the data can live anywhere, right? But in content hubs. But actually, people really didn't want their content data to actually merge with, like they want to keep their data kind of pristine and separate. So when it comes to what needs to happen to make bigger impact, I think in some ways we need the buy-in and trust about some of the techniques used in crowdsourcing to make really strong and accurate information, and also inclusive information. It's been touched on earlier today about the way that archives can be democratized through participation and community engagement. And I think crowdsourcing is a really amazing way to do this, but we have to let it happen, and we have to figure out how that goes. So because of that project, and because of other conversations with Bob Horton, who is at the 2014 WebWise at IMLS, I kind of took it on to start escalating this conversation, and so creating in summer of 2014, began to work on the IMLS, using an IMLS Forum award to create the Crowdsourcing Consortium of Libraries and Archives, CCLA, which goes by the Twitter Crowd Consortium, and it's crowdconsortium.org. So we've done a number of things in this space. We conducted 2 national environmental scans. You may have some people in the room have probably filled out one of our surveys, aimed at libraries and archives to understand the field. So the first survey of over 350 library and archive participants found that over 70% of the respondents thought that a lack of technical expertise was a barrier to trying crowdsourcing in institutions. All this stuff is on crowdconsortium.org, the reports, there's a synopsis. It's really interesting information about an environmental scan. The second survey uncovered perceived barriers to crowdsourcing more deeply, and that was about 160 participants. In that survey, less than 10% of the participants reported that their institution had incorporated linked open data. So this is and the numbers were low about projecting into the future what was going to happen with that. So we also did some webinars with Mia Ridge as a host, and Brett Bobley was in. It's been an inclusive community, Trevor, with Crowdsourcing 101, and we did some webinars, and they were quite well attended. People are interested. They want to know about how to do this stuff, what it would take to scale. And so next week, we have planned a culminating meeting of this forum project where we have cross-institutional support, as Brett mentioned earlier. The University of Maryland is hosting, and they and Dartmouth with NEH, Sloan and IMLS will host Engaging the Public. So there are about 50 people, probably about a fifth of this audience is coming back to DC or going next week. But we also, and we'll be webcasting that too, so it'll be available, the same kind of thing. And so it's really to uncover best practices to really, and we're doing a facilitated conversation with a design firm who will really help the communities pull out and actually get some work done in a practical way. There are a lot of makers or people who really want to try a new way of thinking. So we're working on that way to figure out how we can think about engaging the public and consolidate our national knowledge. So I like the idea that was brought up earlier also of, what are our top 10 pain points? Maybe we can also incorporate that into this conversation since these are happening so closely. So I think that's all I need to say right now. We'll talk more about things in the Q&A.
Good, Trevor.
Great. Well, thank you to IMLS for inviting me. It's a really almost impossible task to try to follow these 3 great people on this panel. And when we were planning this panel in our phone conversation about it, we were kind of trying to figure out, kind of the relationship of what I was going to talk about to the 3 things we've heard about already, because part of why I ended up on this panel was to talk a little bit about data curation as a practice that we might scale up. And I think through that lens, data curation is really interesting because I think productively for this conversation, it's less yet another set of protocols or tools or methodologies, and more something that sits in relationship, or that's the strategy that helps us think about how we deploy all the things we've already heard about, computational techniques and crowdsourcing and linked open data. And then I think in this regard, it's most useful to think of data curation as, kind of our strategic guide for how we, as cultural heritage organizations specifically, deploy and interact with some of the things that we've already heard about. Because I think the interesting role that a sort of data curation focus plays in this conversation around the National Digital Platform is that it asks us to think both about repeatable units in that kind of business and technology sense of scale that we heard a little bit about this morning, right? If part of curation is preservation, then we need to get lean and fast and efficient when we're collecting material from the web, or we're collecting audiovisual material and making sure that that lasts. But I think what's interesting is preservation being a component of curation, right? We can never actually get to curation by just collecting more stuff. Right, that preservation is an important part of our mission, but that curation asks us to do that and to think differently about the materials that we're bringing in. And I think that's what makes it really interesting, and perhaps what might shape how we think about data curation projects as part of the National Digital Platform funding priority. In other words, a lot of the things that we're seeing so far are about helping institutions participate in the platform to bring stuff to the national digital aggregation or aggregations. And I would also like us to see proposals and funded projects that are focusing on, in parallel with that important task, working with communities of users. The absence of our sort of end users has come up today already. Working with communities of those users to be making sort of active reuse of those materials in parallel with all the sort of coordinated institutional work that we're doing to bring it in and preserve it. So just a couple quick examples of what that might look like. I have a colleague at University of Maryland, Ricky Punzlan, who is really interested in virtual reunification of image archives. And to see work like that of going, all right, we're bringing materials into these large national collections. Can we also be working at the same time with people who want to begin to tend those collections at the national level, at that large scale, to think about the shapes of those collections, about their gaps, so that not only the small and excellent team at DPLA or at HathiTrust is charged with enhancing the metadata or the findability of those materials, but that we also have outside people partnering with them who have their own investment of the material to also be adding metadata or adding description, adding value. How do we have projects that bring these metadata mobs to DPLA and HathiTrust sooner rather than later? Because I think it would be a mistake to think about staging these sequentially, right? To get all the stuff together and then worry about, how people are going to be making use of it. But I think curation urges us, as we think about our active management, to be inviting those people in and having projects who are saying they want to work on materials that are already in our national digital platform and begin to enrich them in perhaps more idiosyncratic ways once they're already there. So the image reunification is one project. I think seeing more work around round-tripping data back to something like the National Digital Platform, right? It's there and I get it and I enhance it. How do I give it back? That's a huge challenge that we really haven't grappled with. There's a lot of work to do there. And then I think, this has come up in the Twitter stream and some other places, getting serious about, the usability and collection development and accessioning around our web archives, that would be another great area that we could be working on right away. So those are some near-term priorities that I think are driven by a kind of data curation approach that we might bring into the conversation about the platform. So I think I'll stop there and we can go to discussion.
Great. Thank you all for really interesting comments. We'll take questions in just a minute. Let me ask one question. How hard has it been for you in your individual projects to work with libraries, archives, museums? Truthfully.
Trevor's mouth is twitching.
Yeah, are we on camera here then? Yeah.
Yes,
Right,
many cameras.
on the record, yeah.
I think it's really,
Awesome.
really
It's
important.
awesome.
Well, I guess I'll just say this, and this is about sort of like data curation as a strategy, right? So I work in a library, so, it's great to work with libraries and archives and museums. But I think, a sense of changing the priorities of what we spend more of our time on relative to other things has been a challenging conversation, and having leadership in these organizations sort of helping shape this difficult conversation of maybe there are things we need to stop doing so that we can do other things. That's something I guess I'd like to see more of that would make my life easier.
Good.
I can say, and I may be digging my grave even deeper here, but you can add public media organizations to that list.
All right, I'll happy to
And
add
what I'm
those.
going to say, which is that, it really depends. Okay, can it be tough and frustrating? Absolutely. But I think I was going to mention this actually. It was kind of to Kara Van Malsen's point from earlier this morning. There are internal silos. So it really depends which group you're working with, which person you're working with. And part of the takeaways that I've had over the last few years are that the outputs of these projects need to be immediately kind of understandable and parsable by the internal advocates at those organizations, or even the people who may be, like on the verge, tippable, but they need to see like just what they can leverage and benefit from, and what that implementation will entail, and then it can really, open all kinds of doors, because everybody's learning, and it's just a question of what the learning curve is and how much you can help to educate, in my experience.
Yeah, I would just add, I'd say it varies so greatly by size and the facilities that they have and the tech resources that they have, the person resources, as a lot of people have called out. We actually at Historypin, we have very different strategies with small, medium institutions, particularly it could be, historical societies. They have a great deal of access to the social good because they're so connected in the local community, but they're on the technical side, obviously, we're dealing with big challenges. On the other side of it, on the national and international aggregators, we can start talking about the linked data, the round tripping of data. This is, there's great possibility there.
Good.
So it's very different.
Yeah, I guess I would say as a working outside of library and institutional archives, the metadata games actually emerged out of collaboration with Peter Carini, who's an archivist at the Ronner Library Special Collections at Dartmouth. And originally, I hope he's not in trouble if I say that, he said, just stay away from the library for a while, stay away from the archive, think outside of it. Because that's a way that you can help really move the conversation along. But it's by being an outsider in some ways that, that his argument was that you're going to see this stuff differently. You're going to see our systems differently. And I would agree with that. I think it's, again, I'm speaking as an outsider, so you can see what you will. But I would agree that it's been really helpful. And I've had nothing but really strong interest in the project. But most institutions do seem to feel overwhelmed about trying something new when they feel like there are many, many things to catch up and they can't necessarily figure out which is going to get them ahead faster.
Great. So let's open it up to the audience for your questions, comments. Did lunch put you to sleep?
Yeah, mic drop.
I'll say something. Hi. Ben Vershbaugh, New York Public Library, NYPL Labs. Been working with most of you folks for years on all this stuff. And yeah, so many great points have been raised. I think that, yeah, we find ourselves at an interesting point with crowdsourcing especially, where I think I come from an institution where we did have an appetite to try it, see if it could even be done. And there was traction with users, and we now have produced some significant corpuses of data that have been, that are messy but interesting, or not even that messy in some cases. But in some ways, curatorial interest has been reprioritized or has moved on. Public interest has not. So I think there's this kind of tension of kind of going after the trend and then going after the kind of the long distance run that this kind of, I think, data curation, data stewardship implies and requires for it to really have the impact we all want it to have. Trevor has been sort of extending that chain of custody with a colleague at University of Pennsylvania, Katie Rawson, on curating the menus data from our What's on the Menu transcription project. And now we're trying to think, how do we get that round trip? How do we get that back? And how do we build kind of a new kind of data infrastructure where we can attach these kinds of new forms of data to core records? That integration question is really important. So this is sort of more comments and responses. And I think Cliff Lynch spoke about earlier about the need for kind of like a way to message the public more effectively in a more unified way about these efforts. And I think there's like a bigger narrative of this kind of work that we need to work on developing. There's a call to action involved, but also what are we doing? This is kind of a great data migration project we're all involved in. There's sort of like I have a lot of metaphors in mind, community gardening. But that participation in the act of stewardship, of forward migration of this data, of these collections, develops incredible bonds with the public and raises awareness of these materials. So it does a lot of good for our mission. Trevor has written eloquently on this before. So I think that messaging and the narrative of this work of moving data, it sounds geeky and inaccessible at first, but I think it can be translated into some very grand kind of public service narratives that we can develop. And just to kind of call back to, I think the mix of automated and human approaches is really powerful. And I think that we've seen that's well established with OCR, with text recognition, and then the cleanup. We're seeing really interesting developments in the audiovisual space, going from messy transcripts to kind of more targeted extracted entities and cleaner metadata. We're doing some work with historical maps with the exact same premise, where we're doing a good first pass of maps, urban scale maps, getting kind of building shapes and footprints, and then breaking the quality control and validation into smaller pieces. So I think these are all really important elements, the human-computer collaboration, the narrative of this work, and that figuring out the long-distance kind of stamina required to really see these things through. Because I think we're well past now the question of, do people want to do it? Or will they even participate? They will. And I think more could. It could scale further. So there's just a couple of reflections and
Great.
wonderful presentations. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Comments?
Well, just one follow-up comment on that. I mean, I think the insight actually coming out of, people who've worked deeply in crowdsourcing is, the importance of having the community of people who want to do something, with the things that are produced from crowdsourcing, right? They have a research project, whether we're talking about the Galaxy Zoo folks, right, where they're trying to identify galaxies, or as we work with the menus data, part of cleaning it up is actually figuring out, what matters to the people who are trying to do some kind of scholarly or, sort of who are hobbyists or enthusiasts about it, what matters to them, so that community of interest being there and working with that community and sort of cultivating them, I think is a real key part of that. That goes beyond just the kind of mechanics of, sharing data out and data in.
I think we can also raise the profile of and help with this narrative that Ben speaks of if we're also focusing some time on the interoperability and the round tripping and making sure that organizations can trust, oh wow, look, I've seen the map, I understand the loop, and it's working, and it can work for other groups. And once we can start to unite the projects, I think is another way that can become visible.
And it certainly helps with the issue of scale, because we'll never be able to do all of these things if we try to do them ourselves, right? And we have to open it up to others. Any other comments on?
Well, Ben, I really like your point about the time frames. I think that's a huge bit on projects we've been working on really for the last 3 years with what we started to consider knowledge communities, right? So these were the enthusiasts or people who know a location really well, et cetera. It takes time for them to trust you, for starters. And then there's also this idea of co-creating with them. So a lot, kind of adding this design theory to not only how we do things, but how the community does things with us. And that's a matter of trust. It's a matter of building their confidence. But it is definitely a longer term time frame than a 2-year grant, right? So if you got this grant, by the time it ends and you're writing your reports, now you're getting ready to get busy with the community.
Great, thanks. Micah.
I want to see what this group has to say about some other issues than what you've talked about. So I think it's interesting that our panel on scale is primarily addressing things that I would say are probably, most of us would agree, are not yet completely core in libraries. So crowdsourcing, linked open data, we are interested in both those things, trying very hard to work in that space. It is still somewhat less core than things like collecting research volumes or circulating. And so one question I have, as you have thought about how to scale these activities that, to use an earlier metaphor, are perhaps somewhat around the fringe and moving towards the core, becoming core library work, what lessons have you learned that you think might apply to also thinking about approaches to scaling and sharing other perhaps, even more fundamental or central functions, like, just to throw out a couple examples of things that to me scream out for some scaled solution. I don't see much work in this space. Things like account management, to have, best-in-class user accounts and best-in-class privacy around that. Things like shared discovery layers or tools for creating your own discovery layer in a shared way. Are there lessons you've learned from your work to scale these projects that could be applied in those other problems?
Who wants to jump in?
Go first. Actually.
Well, it's a lot of this for Historypin particularly is looking at increasingly just design thinking around users, and I think that's been huge. I don't have a great concept of how things really work behind the scenes at libraries. Typically, the people we work with are looking for a discovery layer. So there's kind of looking for what is the easiest way to get data from point A to point B, and that's why I think we're looking at how do we best do that? Is there a way you can tell us what you have, tell us how we can use it, and then we can do that. And I think as we've, in the last 5 years of working on this, it has been it started with, this is obviously what you need, and this is how you use it. And now we're really going back and redesigning everything and thinking, okay, how is it that you work now, and understanding these workflows. A lot of the work that you guys are doing, you think of partnerships with D schools and design, kind of really looking at that element is a huge part of how we should approach these problems with the user in mind, ultimately.
I can jump in quickly. I'm reminded of that successful complex systems ultimately are born of much, much simpler systems, and that to start building something complex from scratch, it's almost inevitably doomed to fail. And to John's point, I mean, I think the reason Pop-Up Archive exists is because Bailey and I spent a year plus in graduate school at a school of information, which was very focused on design thinking and iterative software development, and it was totally new to both of us. We were, humanities people, former journalists, and didn't even realize just how steeped in it we were over the course of the time we were there until we left. But having that time to go out and do user research, and I mean, I'm finding surveys that we did in 2011 that I don't even remember, that are still relevant and informative to the work that we're doing now. And I think, in the day-to-day, at most museums, libraries, and archives, there just isn't time to do that kind of work. And when you're applying for grant funding, it's often the component that ends up kind of hitting the cutting room floor, because it doesn't quite make it into the budget. And so, I know there was some conversation about this earlier today too. I think it's really important, not just for documentation and maintenance to be a part of these projects, but also for user research and education to be a part of it too.
Well, and I guess I want to pick at the question a little bit, because I feel like there are a lot of things that libraries, and I don't know the museum and archive world as well, but that libraries are doing where they are trying to share and centralize some of these core things. I mean, the Koali project, a number of these activities. But I guess what I find that might be translatable is a lot of those activities, whether it's, the Koali tools around, integrated library systems or shared print repositories or something, they feel at the moment like they're being done in a kind of back of the house, let's be as lean and efficient as we can and sort of keep our bother out of the sight of our users and communities. And that, I think, is a different spirit than a lot of these things that aren't yet core, but we want to become core, are operating in, right? I think a lot of the case that many of us are making are about, the excitement or, the engagement that we can get out of doing this new thing. And, that's a lot of the argument that we're making to our leadership. And I don't see that same kind of argument being made around some of these other really key important things, like, what should the library discovery layers be like, or our ebook activities, or our shared print. So I wonder if that's the thing that needs to come across, and that sort of thinking about, how is this not a back of the office task, but a part of our sort of engagement with our community of users and people that care passionately about all this stuff that we have. I don't know, that's a sort of half-formed.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it connects to Meredith's comment earlier about engaging our communities. Do you have any particular examples or paradigms? Building an open source ILS is not a project like transcribing a little bit of text for a menu. How do we turn it into something more like that, if that's what you're suggesting?
Well, I think to me, it resonates more with actually the point you were making about ebooks, right? Like, in a lot of sense, I think, it's to not be dependent on vendors, but we haven't gone all the way through to saying, like, what would it mean for us to have sort of self-determination in this area, right? Like, the ILS could become a sort of powerful and exciting thing. That might be a bit much, but, could be kind of a positive thing if we thought about it in terms of, like, taking back ownership of our relationship with our, communities of use. And having that be sort of the central narrative of the project, instead of just being like, let's be another entrant into a marketplace.
I know I already talked, but I'm just going to qualify what I said earlier. When Pop-Up Archive started, we never thought that machine transcription would even be a part of what we did. So the user research that we were doing was taking people back to square one and saying, fundamentally, for a lot of producers who found themselves self-described accidental archivists, what is your ideal relationship with this material that you're creating and becoming stewards of, whether you like it or not, that you recognize the value in, but fundamentally, what relationship to this would work for you? How can we talk a lot about making archiving part of the production workflow, right? And fundamentally, what should that look like? Let's talk about that. Let's ask a lot of people to draw their pie in the sky visions of what that might look like, and then try to, to boil it down to the nuts and bolts. And for us, the computational piece was like icing on the cake that has, become something I'm happy to talk about, but wasn't even why we started doing this.
Mary, you want to comment on this?
Yeah, just really quickly, the thinking about crowdsourcing and tagging, it seems like we're actually gathering data. And the original impetus was to gather data about archival material that we didn't know much about, right? And that is still a really helpful thing. But I think what we're hearing over and over again as we iterate these projects is that software developers are really engineering the social, and that maybe libraries, museums, and archives are really far more social design than they are artifact design. And if that's the case, then we have to, has anyone played Trivia Crack?
No.
Okay, thank you, thank you. So all my students play Trivia Crack. It's an app. And I was just, this is an anecdote, I'm just gonna go there though. So I was diagramming for my students in my game design class, okay, well, how does Trivia Crack work? It's a trivia game online. You think, oh, the majority of the task is about gathering trivia questions. But users can actually input trivia questions, and users can upvote and downvote other people's trivia questions, and users can point out problems with the trivia questions. And if you actually look at the ecosystem of Trivia Crack, about 10% is really time spent with the trivia question. And that's not what you would think if you just saw the words, well, I don't know what you would think if you saw the words Trivia Crack, but if you said, I'm gonna go play a trivia app, you would not think of it as 90% social engineering, right? And I think that this is something that just emerges more and more in the work that I've been doing, is like, it becomes far more of a design challenge in the social sphere than a technological sphere, although the technology is, of course, in there, iteratively so.
Question down here.
I want to, Michael, again, sorry. I want to throw the gauntlet down a little bit about scale. I wonder throughout the day and throughout following this project if we're talking about an incremental change model, or I don't want to use the word radical, or the way Google talks about a 10 times improvement model. And I have the feeling that we're thinking about scale collectively in a very small way. A lot of us were really profoundly struck when TED served its billionth video in 2013. We look at the kind of traction, the kind of actually profound user engagement you get on Reddit. When our curators appear on Reddit, it's many orders of magnitude, more eyeballs seeing more engagement, capital E, than on our own websites. Some of you have seen what I've been talking about with the Vlog brothers, Hank and John Green. Just tens of millions of people raising millions and millions of dollars. And I wonder if we're in our subconsciously designing a project that's just going to be a little bit better, sort of a digital version of the levels of scale that we get with traditional libraries, or if we're really thinking about, within a decade, we're going to have 7 or 8 billion people online. The kinds of scale that could and should be designed for with them in mind. Most of those people are going to be most of the next 5 billion are going to be from kind of marginal governments. Most of them are going to be poor. Most of them are going to be hungry for the kinds of resources that these organizations, kind of knowledge creation that we stand for. What are we going to do when they arrive? What are we going to do now so that when they arrive, there's something for them that's good?
Panel.
I'll start. Thanks for that, Michael. Yeah, man. Let's do it this way. I mean, the things I've sworn to myself I'm going to make it through without swearing once. All right. So the stuff that Seb is doing that is so exciting to me is if you close your building down for 3 years and you reinvent everything, what would you come up with? And that's the kind of stuff that people are coming up with. And what would happen if we closed our libraries down completely for 3 years? I mean, obviously you wouldn't want to do this, but that's the kind of thinking where we could get at scale, where we could start to say, how would we build everything around either the content, around the people? What are the assets that we have? What does that look like? That's a very exciting conversation to have.
We can have that conversation.
Just do it right now.
What
I would put-
are those features?
I don't know. I think to me, I would start by building something in the environment of the web. I mean, that's what I love about what Seb and Aaron and the whole team have done over there, is that the database was the key to everything that they were going to, you could surface things, you could change things around. And I would say it wouldn't be just what I have in my own institution, but what everyone else has. So if we all started collectively to go at it that way, now you've got something very different. And you could say, I would also say these institutions have huge social value. And it's been completely underestimated. It's not quantified in our grant reports and our evaluation, anything like this. And that's something that I would want to focus on as well. What do they really do to strengthen the communities? Nobody really talks about libraries in that way, but that's a huge element. So the evaluation bit of that is a factor too.
Mary,
Anyone?
you ready to jump in?
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's always in a planning meeting. How far can we go, right? I mean, if the futurists have different conversations about what 2030 looks like than other groups. So I think regardless of what kind of radical change we have, we know that there are certain pain points anyway, and that may be the place to focus, so that we can actually allow for a phase shift, like having data be able to be free and talk to each other. We're going to need that no matter what kind of large-scale something happens. So being able to incorporate the public in a new way has to be a part of this conversation. So I think that we have some really interesting seeds for that kind of radical conversation.
No, I want to be at the table for that conversation. I mean, I don't want to repeat myself, but I think I like to frame our work often as, what we can do to make audio findable by Google, right? And so I come at it, especially working in public media and like RSS feeds, this open protocol where we can go out and identify all of this media that is, the digital radio of today, assess its value independently and incorporate it into the work that we do for that reason. And I think, I would, I'd love to be a part of that conversation about making it happen more systemically.
Well, and I mean, I was reflecting on something that came up in the conversation earlier this morning about, if we look at the communities that many of the institutions that we work at consider their constituency, it's actually not a national constituency. It's something much more local to them. And there's a great, there's a great inertia to stay, to preserve the institution which serves that local constituency that provides our little local resources. And I don't know, maybe part of the way to break that open, because I think it would be difficult for me, to tell the state of Maryland, for instance, the state of Maryland will get some good stuff, but, we're off on this national thing, and we're, this is part of the problem that we all have in many of our institutions. And that part of perhaps what we're struggling toward here is the way in which something like the National Digital Platform, though I think portfolio or some other term might work better here, is, the narrative that allows us to sort of make that argument that helps us kind of break open our local institution a little bit more. And I wonder if that helps us toward some of the challenge, Mike, that you're pointing us to. I mean, on a technical level, right, I think it is about like that the web is the way to go, that's a kind of a proven direction. But I mean, there's so many other dimensions to this about sort of, the institutional realities and some of the policies, and we have to break those open too in order to sort of really attack your problem of scale.
I love the idea, though, of thinking about, okay, why isn't Reddit AMA, the Ask Me Anything, why isn't that reference library? Like, why to really engage with the public and interface where people are at and where the tools are at. It was really exciting.
Right. Well, Blaine, I think you're the next person.
Blaine Dessy, Library of Congress, and I represent one of those institutions that Deanna mentioned about what are national institutions doing. But I have a very practical question, and coming at this from a national institution, or even if I were from a funding agency, when we talk about scaling to practice, what does that mean tangibly? I'm not a technologist. I'm just a bureaucrat. But if you were to say, that's what I am. It's not that funny.
It just works in this town.
But you know, and so if you were to come to me and say, Blaine, we got to scale to practice. This is critical. What does that mean? What would I do? Do I start convening meetings tomorrow? Do I buy people software? Do I write review? What are we talking about in terms of people in positions of influence being able to move this forward?
It might be to get out of the way. Honestly, that might be part of it. I do think that the working on the web and the way of the web is a totally different cultural construct. And one of the, I mean, it goes along with Michael's thing here too. If we're going to talk about this kind of a scale, we are making a lot of small incremental changes. And even if you look at the metadata that we're dealing with, you know, we've gone from card catalog records to something very different now when we're starting to put things on the web. That's a whole different thing. And we don't want to make those little adjustments. We want to do something quite a bit differently. And I think for me, from somebody who's a policymaker or somebody in a major institution, it's how do you enable the people on your teams to do this quite a bit differently and experiment with things quite a bit, you know, in not necessarily radical, but entirely different ways. That is how people are communicating differently, without also alienating or, you know, keeping in mind your end user and your ultimate goals. But it's not to be an institution in the end.
I mean, I guess sort of in a riff off of that, I mean, I would suggest that, like, if we wanted to talk about scaling up practice, I mean, maybe you would start off with a meeting in which you'd bring together everyone in your organization and you'd say, here's where we're trying to get, and we're going to change everybody's job, right? We're not just going to add a new person to do this new thing, and the other 9 of you are going to keep doing what you were doing before. I think that would be a really critical thing if you were going to start talking about scaling up practice. You know, it's got to be everybody's job.
The wheel, and when it comes to scale, that's like paramount. So to give your team to have that meeting and say, let's go out and see what's been done, and this is why I talked about the importance of any of these projects, especially when they're federally funded, having outputs that are digestible by the people at organizations who are going to be able to take that information and figure out how they work it into what they're trying to scale at their organization and how they can leverage that or latch on to that, and then in turn provide back, you know, through their work, more information, more tidbits that others can add to the sort of the collective knowledge. Yeah.
I'm going to take this to the next week meeting.
Yeah.
This is a great question.
Yeah.
Tom?
Tom Kramer from Stanford University. There was something that happened, John, while you were speaking. You used lodlam as a verb. And I don't know if you did that on purpose or not, but several people caught it. Okay. So you're now going to be quoted on that. And I just wanted to talk about briefly the value of verbs or the value of tools, which is the way I think you scale practice, and the way you make things more accessible to a broader set of people is by giving them a simple tool that does a job well and that people understand the value. And so you can pop up archive, I've heard, you can Google things, you can Reddit things, you can even do data curation. I think we know what that is. You can't lodlam something. I mean, this is one of the great frustrations of we who are working in linked data, is it's still too abstract. Crowdsourcing is kind of a mindless panacea. It's like, I'll run it in the cloud, I'll crowdsource it. You can say, well, I'll use a Zooniverse tool, or I'll use metadata games, or I'll use the SI transcription viewer. And I think from a national digital platform perspective, one of the things that this group might do is identify what those little tools are, and really drive the identification and adoption of those tools, and really get more people playing in the milieu.
Totally.
Great comment.
That's a great point.
Jim?
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about Blaine's question, what should the national organizations do? And I think there are 4 areas where they can be very helpful. One is the area of advocacy, talking this up, making it clear that this is a national priority. 2, information policy, helping us to get the right legal and legislative framework so that we can better serve our users through content and technology. 3rd is professional development. We'll hear more about that in the next session, but I think these organizations have the ability to build the type of leadership and professional development capacities for the wider community. And 4th is global leadership, positioning us around the world in terms of how we're going to knit together these various initiatives and to help us address the question of Europeana is easy. How do we deal with the developing worlds of Africa, South Asia, Latin America, and really begin to address those questions? Because these organizations have important connections in those world areas.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Any response from the panel?
No.
They were just
Thank you.
gratitude, I
Good.
think.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jeff Resnick. I'm with the National Library of Medicine. I direct the History of Medicine division there. So further, Jim, to all 4 of your points, NLM is working across those various fronts. And particularly, as many know, I was talking with Brewster about it earlier today, about NLM and the National Institutes of Health leading the way in open access. And this is something we continue to do despite challenges, and we hope that that effort and the resources can be of use to this community. Looking forward, if there are resources, the National Library of Medicine as one of America's 3 national libraries that could be useful, I'd be happy to connect with you and have a conversation and invite you out to our institution. Just wanted to put in a plug there. So this has been an incredibly engaging conversation, and from that vantage point of one of the other national libraries, I think that the idea of knowledge communities as they are defined in the medical or scientific context. Certainly the National Science Foundation plays a role, but there's no other place in the United States that generates so much medical knowledge. And the National Library of Medicine is a storehouse of that, and through our databases and various other resources. So just to throw that out there, to think about, as we grow these communities of knowledge, as we find their interconnectivity, what about the personalization of that knowledge as it relates to health, as it relates to well-being? Right. I think that's a dimension that I'll call out. And then finally, one of the premier advances that's unfolding now at the National Institutes of Health is the Precision Medicine Initiative that President Obama announced in his State of the Union earlier this year. And the NIH Director, Francis Collins, is firmly behind this Precision Medicine Initiative. And I think that defines, in many ways, the personalized nature of data, of information vis-a-vis health in this world of exploding data. So how do we navigate that? And I think there are all the questions that you're raising, overlaying them on top of personal data, individual data in a world of, a pool of data is I think puts a particular spin on this that's very challenging to navigate through.
Extremely good point. Thank you. Lucy?
Hi, and I'll just quickly add a 5th one to what Jim added as something that I think we could be working on even as other tools and issues need to be being developed for this portfolio, I'm using the new word, is that we need to be actually working with the users of the future on their digital literacy in order to use these resources and make of them what they will, so that they can make videos or reuse videos to make new projects or do what Trevor was talking about, Rich does or encourages people to do with the products in archives to make new, reuse digital materials and make new things. So I know we sponsor a new small grant to encourage literacy engagement with historical materials, but obviously there's a need to encourage that kind of work with data materials, all types of, for reading. I mean, education, the Department of Education does it too, but I mean, that type of development of younger people needs to carry along, or else, in a sense, we're building a product, a product that you're going to say, well, they're just going to grow up in it. You know, they're the digital generation. They'll know how to use it. But I think that there's been, you know, enough work to show that they don't just know how to use it, that to keep working on that side, it also teaches us what we don't know about how they use things, which is equally important, the case user studies and all that part of it. So that's my fifth part. So thank you.
Thank you. Are there other people ready to speak?
Well, in the meantime, I just want to get back to the sciences point there, because I think we're pretty humanities heavy in this meeting. So I really like the science point. And when you talk about particularly linked data, scaling things across connective archives, databases, huge advances are happening there. You have so much more funding in those areas. I mean, when we talk about doing linked open data projects within humanities, it's just the scale is so much smaller, and I think there's a lot to be learned from what's happening in that space that can be transferable. And I love this idea of intersection, the data exploration. You know, when you start to do how you visualize this data, could be pretty intense.
I think we all have so much. We're so much in the debt of the National Library of Medicine for doing so much good work in this area. So I think it's really great to see you here so that the humanities and the sciences can talk together a bit more.
Thank you, Deanna. That sounds like a wonderful note for us to wrap up on. Jim just asked me if there was chocolate, so.
Please join me in thanking the panel for their very good comments.